Hi, welcome to this session on student finance, which is really spelling out the real cost of going to university. Hopefully you've seen this early enough that it's going to come into your thinking when you're making plans for your move after school. And hopefully the information in here will be relevant and useful to you. We do try and keep this up to date, but occasionally things do change mid-session. So please double check that the figures that we quote are correct before taking them as certain. Okay, so I guess if you're here, you probably got a fair idea that you have got university in your sights, in your plans. But I wonder if you're one of these people who fall into this category, the 77% that are worried or put off by the costs of university. What we're going to try and do by the end of this chat, the end of this session, is to try and move you out of that 77% that are concerned and worried into the 23% that are not concerned by the costs of going through uni. Now, we're obviously very much at the beginning of our journey, but we're not going to just sort of do this one video, or if you're seeing it live, we're just sort of going to come in and disappear. That's not the case. We're going to be around for the next few years, all the way through your journey through university. And if you have any concerns or questions that you'd like to ask us at any point in the future, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll give you the email address at the end of the session. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to look at the different types of support options that you've got. That's free money in the form of grants, bursaries and scholarships, and also student loans, which we will be dividing into two parts, part looking at the tuition fees and part looking for the living costs. We'll also be discussing how you go about applying for that as well. We will be looking at the interest element and how much the overall amount changes after you leave university, and also how you will be expected to repay that money as time goes through. So let's make a start with the different types of support that you've got. As I've already mentioned, there is an opportunity to get some free money, non-repayable, in the form of grants, bursaries and scholarships. Not that easy to get, but everybody is eligible to look around and apply for them. The more of these we get, the less money we will need to borrow, so it makes perfect sense to actually try to get that in place. And you can start that whole process really as soon as you like. There's no sort of switch on time, if you like, to start putting applications in for grants, bursaries and scholarships. So keep your eye open and start to do a little bit of work on that when you can. The second part of support that you'll get are student loans, and they come from a company called the Student Loan Company, but please don't worry too much about that name. It's the UK government that will be paying you the money, and it's the UK government that you will be sending the money back to as well when you start to repay the debt. So how do you go about applying for support? Well, the whole process of student funding through the Student Loan Company will begin here in school around February, March of the year that you are leaving, so of year 13. When you start that process, you'll probably be told that you need to get your application in by somewhere like May. The reason for that is that gives then the Student Loan Company plenty of time to do all of the work on the loans to ensure that the money's in the right place at the right time for when you start uni. However, if you decide quite late in the piece that you're going to go to uni, or you change your mind, please don't worry, because you can still apply for support up to 9 months after the course has started. Now, obviously, that does mean that the money won't necessarily be in the right place at the right time, which may give you a small cash flow problem. But please don't think because you've missed that May deadline that there is no support for you. That's not the case. You can still get financial support after that deadline. You will begin, as I say, the whole process here in school. Most people tend to use online websites to actually make that application. If you prefer, you can still get paper forms to fill in and send away. You won't be able to finish the whole thing in school though, I'm afraid, because part of the process will be means tested, so your household income will be taken into account, which means that your folks will need to be involved in the application process. Now, even if you know that you're going to be doing a 3 or a 4 year course, your application only lasts for 1 year, so you will have to reapply every year. Now, the good news is that whilst the first year might take you 45 minutes to an hour to complete, every subsequent year is just a mouse click, provided yours or your folks' circumstances haven't changed. However, if mum or dad has changed jobs, different salary, maybe they've retired, maybe they're unemployed for a short period of time, you do need to make sure that all of the records are kept up to date, because that may affect the amount of money you can borrow in subsequent years. And I would strongly urge you all to keep that data up to date when it happens, rather than sort of waiting until the last minute to try and get that done. The reason for that is quite simple. You'll probably forget. You'll have so much on when you go into uni that small detail of different £5,000-10,000 of income change at home will be forgotten, but that could affect the amount of money that you could be borrowing. So the next slide is a very short video which gives the outlines of what you need to do to apply, and then we'll go through that in a little bit more detail afterwards.
Before the start of term, you'll want to make sure your student finance is sorted. That's why it's important for you to complete the following steps. First, check that you've submitted your application with the correct supporting evidence if required. Then register at your university or college. We won't make your first student finance payment until you do. Also, make sure your bank account details are up to date. The easiest way to do this is by logging on to your account. Your account will also show your payment dates and status. Your tuition fee loan will be paid in 3 instalments, directly to your university or college. Maintenance loans will also be paid at the same time throughout the academic year. You should allow a few working days for the funds to be paid into your bank account. It's that easy.
Okay, before we go into the detail of your student loan, let's look in a little bit more detail for the free money that might be on offer. And we're going to look at grants, scholarships and bursaries in turn. But we're going to start off with grants. Now, there are literally thousands of different grants out there. They could be from individuals, from companies, from charitable trusts, loads and loads of places. Very difficult to do all of that groundwork yourself. So I would suggest using something called Scholarship Hub as a bit of a search engine for grants that might be available. And we used Scholarship Hub and we came up with these particularly odd grants that there's no way we would have known about unless we'd have got some help. First one, if you happen to like singing and you're prepared to sing in a choir and you want to go down to Exeter, potentially there's a £3,500 grant waiting for you. Obviously, you can't just pitch up and sing a few notes, take your money and not go back. There is an expectation of you being part of that choir for a period of time. Secondly, and one of the more odd ones, is if you have a second name of Graham. So if you're Mr. or Miss Graham and you decide to go to one of the Scottish universities, there's potentially £500 in it for you just for having that surname of Graham. That comes via the Graham Trust, and the reason that money is there is because Mr. Graham made a lot of money back in the day. He had no family to leave it to, so he left it in trust to his wider family, anyone with the same name as him, and anybody that went to the same university as he did up in Scotland is eligible for a £500 grant. Next one, if you've got an interest in esports and you want to take a degree in esports, then there is a £1,500 grant waiting for you. Your interests are important, but also your parents' occupation could be important when it comes to a grant as well. Many companies will have funds available for the children of employees who are going off to university. I've put just one down here, which is the Navy, but all of the armed forces, but many other companies as well, will have some sort of grant available to students of employees. So please get your mums and dads to check that out before you apply. Up to £3,000 is available. Now, perhaps one of the weirder ones here is for those people that are vegetarians, and I'm not sure, to be honest, how you prove that, but I guess if you are, join the Vegetarian Society, because if you do, potentially there's a £500 grant waiting for you as well. So all worthwhile, and of course you can apply for multiple grants. You don't just have to do one, you can do as many as you like. Next, we go on to scholarships, which come from the faculty of the university or college that you're going to be attending. Anybody can apply, and there are scholarships there for all different types of people. So some may be for sportsmen, musicians, actors, low-income families. Pretty much everybody is covered, and everybody is eligible to apply. One of the things that surprised me is one of our colleagues who helps deliver this stuff into schools also works for the University of East London, and she tells me that in 2 of the last 3 years they were unable to give out as much money as they wanted to because they just didn't have enough applications. So you are doing all of the universities a favour by applying. Please don't leave that money unspent. And the last one I want to look into are bursaries. Now, bursaries are chunks of money given by an employer. And they started back in the day when the NHS, who is still the biggest bursary giver in the UK, were giving out 100% bursaries. So they were paying for all tuition fees on a wide range of different degrees. Unfortunately, about 12, 13 years ago, when cuts started being made, the 100% bursaries had cut back to 60%, and the wide range of degrees was also narrowed. There was a very nice agreement between people that took the bursary and the bursary giver, especially when it was the NHS, that if people wanted to buy themselves out of the employment, because there was an expectation of people working for the NHS after they graduated to sort of repay the debt that they'd got, not through financially, but through time and expertise. If they wanted to buy themselves out of that, they could actually do so on a pro rata basis. Now, by pro rata, that means that if the NHS had invested £15,000 into a particular individual and they expected them to work for 5 years, paying it off at a rate of £3,000 a year, remember, not financially, but just in time and expertise, and somebody wanted to leave after 3 years, they could stump up £6,000 and they would buy themselves out the rest of their contract. It was very amicable and relatively cheap to do. With the cuts, there are obviously less now bursaries given by the NHS and also the armed forces. So private industry has started taking their place. And a lot of companies now will be offering you guys 18, come and work for us. We will pay you a wage. We will also put you through university so that when you graduate, not only will you graduate with no debt, you may even have a little bit of savings, and you'll also have a job for the next 3 or 5 years. Looks fantastic, and many of them are. I would just give a word of caution though, and ask you to make sure that you ask lots of questions. Because when I rang up one of the high street banks and questioned if my son or daughter got one of these bursaries and decided to leave after 3 years of a 5-year term once they graduated, could they buy themselves out on a pro rata basis just like they did at the NHS? The answer was negative. They would have to actually repay everything that had been paid to them over the course of their studies and over the course of getting their grant. So that could be potentially sort of £100,000. So I'm not saying they are all like that. I am urging caution though, before you actually sign on the dotted line. Ask lots and lots and lots of questions. And if you don't get the right answers or the answers you would hope for, it might be better to go down the student finance route, getting a student loan, than it is to go down this particular bursary route. There is one other group of students that can benefit from grants, and those are students with disabilities. It's physical disabilities. Every case is looked at individually. These are the maximum figures we are currently talking about. So you would make your application exactly the same way, and you would be judged upon not just all the other criteria, but also on your disability as well. Right, let's move on to student loans. And as I said earlier on, we're going to look at these in two parts: part to pay for tuition fees and part to pay for living costs. Now, the maximum that people can be charged over the next couple of years for a full-time course is held at £9,250. That is set by the government, and that is the maximum you can be charged. If you decide to do a 2-year accelerated course to save some of that money, well, unfortunately, the maximum then goes up to £11,100 per year. And if you decide to do a part-time course, then the maximum is £6,935 a year. Now, you can, of course, shop around. And if you are lucky enough to find a course that you'd like in an area that you would like, then you may find it for £7,500. You can only borrow up to £7,500. You cannot borrow more than the tuition fee costs of your course. One thing to bear in mind, if you are lucky enough to find one of these courses that is cheaper than the maximum and your university has been getting good results, it could have been given something called Teaching Excellence Framework, TEF. If your university has TEF, it means as a reward the government allows them to increase their rates in line with inflation until they reach the maximum. So they can increase the rates every year until they reach the maximums that are already on the screen in front of you. So if you do go to one of these TEF universities, be prepared, second and third years will not be as cheap as the first year that's there. The money that comes in will not go via your bank account. It will be paid directly to your university or college, 1/quarter at the beginning of the first term, a quarter at the beginning of the second term, and half at the beginning of the third term. It will not go through your bank account. The only way you'll know that that money's been paid is to log on to your student loan account and you'll see a balance on there. And from the very first day, it will start to accrue interest, which I'll tell you a lot more in a moment. Can I ask a question? How many of people who are watching this are planning to stay at home with their parents? My guess is not very many. Nationally, I think it's about 5% of people stay at home. That figure is increasing though, because this is definitely the cheapest option when it comes to getting your degree. So don't put it out of your mind straight away. If budgeting is something that you really need to take into account, then it makes absolute sense to use that as an option as well. If you stay at home with your parents, of course, you're unlikely to have any rent. You're not really going to have much in the way of bills. Your fares are going to be relatively low and your food is probably going to be supplied. So it is definitely an option worth thinking about. But for those of you that are going to be moving away, has anybody even checked into how much student halls cost? Never mind flat sharing. Depending on whereabouts in the UK you're thinking about going to uni, the amount that you could be charged for your student halls will vary considerably. This is just a little table of some of the costs, and we could go from a high, which is QMC in London, of £16.20 per month for a very nice single room with ensuite facilities, all the way down to a shared room in Huddersfield, which would be for £280 a month. So your location and the type of facilities that you want will have a big bearing on the cost. It always used to be that students decided what course they wanted and what university they were going to go to, and then they thought about how much it might cost as a sort of almost like an afterthought. Now, to use an analogy, if you were going to buy a car, would you decide on the make and model of the car first and then find out how much that was going to cost? Or would you decide how much you could afford and then look at what came within your budget? Because I think students are starting to wise up to the idea that if they want to keep their costs down, they have to try and budget responsibly and realistically when it comes to the universities they go to. So I would urge people to start thinking about how much debt are you prepared to get into to go to the university of your choice. So let's go on then to loans for living costs. And the exact amount that you are going to be eligible to borrow will depend on three things. And that's where you're living, where you're studying, and what your household income is. As I go through this, I'm going to give you two figures, a maximum and a minimum figure. These are the two extremes of what you're going to be able to borrow. The actual amount will depend on your household income. Unlike your tuition fee loans, where your household income has no bearing at all on your ability to borrow against the cost of your course, everybody can borrow the same amount. With living costs, the more money that's coming into your house means the less money you're going to be allowed to borrow. Now, if you decide to live with your parents, you can get a maximum of £8,400 a year and a minimum of £3,700. And as we've already said, this is definitely the cheapest option, but you're still able to get a relatively healthy loan against it. If you decide to move away somewhere in England but not London, then the amount you can borrow goes up to a maximum of just under £10,000 and a minimum of just over £4,500. Now, of course, you do have to pay your own rent, your own bills, get all your own food, have your travel. You'll still need equipment, clothing and socialising money. So even if you were on the maximum here, that's still going to be quite a tough ask. What about if you decide to live and study in London? Then the amounts go up to £13,000 maximum and a minimum of £6,500. Now, whilst that sounds like that's a lot more money, in real terms, there'll be no more disposable income than if you were studying outside of London, because rents and the general cost of living in London is going to be that much more money. Now, here's the first thing that you really need to understand. Depending on what you are granted, there is an expectation from government that your parents will pay the difference between what you're given and the maximum in the criteria that you're in. So as an example, let's say you were going to be living and studying outside of London and you were being granted a loan of £7,000 per year. There is a government expectation that your parents will pay the difference between £7,000 and £9,978. Of course, the difference is the government haven't told your parents. They've left you to have that conversation. So I would urge all of you to have that conversation with your folks sooner rather than later, because if they are in a position to help, then the more notice you can give them, the better that's going to be for them. And if they're not going to be in a position to help, it's much better that you know that early, because you can then do something about it, rather than waiting until the last minute and then being disappointed that you're going to be very, very underfunded for your trip. The money that you're granted will be paid into your bank account, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 each term. So you must understand your way around a budget. And if you haven't already watched it, I would strongly urge you to watch our budgeting and earning extra money session after you finish this one. Now, I explained that there was a maximum and minimum, the two extremes. Now I'm going to tell you exactly how that's calculated and what you might get. For you to get the maximum loan available, your household income needs to be less than £25,000. And by household income, I don't just mean salaries. I mean any pensions that's coming in, any rental income that's coming in, any benefits that's coming in, any interest on savings, any dividends on share portfolios, absolutely everything coming into the house before tax, with the exception of any maintenance payments that's being paid for you or brothers and sisters by a parent that's living away. For you to only get the minimum, then your household income needs to be more than £58,291 if you're living at home, more than £62,343 if you're living and studying outside of London but away from home, or £70,040 if you're living and studying in London but away from home. It doesn't matter if your household income is much, much more than that, you are still eligible to get the minimum amounts that we were speaking about. There are 4 other things that will affect your ability to get a living cost loan, or the amount of money anyway. Firstly, I wouldn't suggest, because it's not financially very wise. Having your own child will allow you to get a greater student loan, but the cost of having your own child is currently thought to be around £250,000 each by the time they are 16. So I wouldn't suggest that that's a particularly good idea. Second one, if you are a carer, full-time or part-time, and you are registered as such, you could be eligible for some extra money. If you have learning disabilities or a physical disability, obviously you can get your grant if you have a physical disability, but for a learning disability, you could be eligible for extra loan. And finally, if you live on your own at the time you make your application, then again, you could be eligible for some extra money. Right, let's move on to the amount of interest you are likely to pay. But just before we do that, I just wanted to say to you that the mean amount of debt that students are currently getting into for a 3-year course is in the region of £45,000. So when I go through these figures, I'm basing it on the mean amount of £45,000. Obviously, if you borrow less, the figures I'm going to be talking about will be smaller. And if you borrow more, then the figures will be somewhat bigger. Now, the interest element is fixed once a year in line with the retail price index. It's fixed every April for the March RPI. And that is the interest rate that you will be charged for the next academic year. So if you are going to university in September 2024, your interest rate will be fixed in April 2024 for the following academic year, all the way through to September 2025. Currently, and we're in a very high inflation scenario at the moment, the last fixing, which was in April of this year, was 13.5% for RPI. That means that students that are starting this September know that they would be paying 13.5% RPI. Now, the government did understand that that was extremely high and unfair, so they have come in to put a cap on it at 7.1%. Now, whilst that doesn't affect you directly, it is important because there is now precedent for the government to come in to cap out the amount of money that you could be charged in interest. There is no guarantee that it's going to be there, but it's very good that they've come in and recognised that 13.5 was just way, way, way too much money. Now, if we go back to our mean amount of £45,000, if interest rates stay where they are at 7.1%, it means your debt after you leave uni will increase at just under £3,200 a year. And of course, that is going to be compounding. So that amount of interest will increase as your balance increases as well. So what do you actually pay back? Well, the interesting thing here is if we think about any normal loan, the more money you borrow, the more money you have to repay every month. If you took out a car loan, for example, for £5,000, that might cost you £250 a month. If you took out a car loan for £25,000, it might cost you £850 a month. The more you borrow, the more you repay. With your student finance, it doesn't work in the same way. The amount of money you borrow has no bearing at all on what you repay. The amount you repay depends solely on what you are earning in your job. If you're earning less than £25,000 by the time you leave uni and start work, then there is no expectation of repayment at all. But of course, interest will continue to accrue on your debt. But anything that you earn over £25,000, you will have to, not choose to, but have to repay 9% of those earnings above that £25,000 threshold. That means if you had a job that paid you £35,000 a year gross, there would be an expectation that you would have to pay 9% of the 10,000 above 25 grand back to the student loan company. So your student loan repayment that year would be £900. If you go abroad, this debt goes with you. So don't think if you go to Australia or to America to live and work, you don't have to pay your student debt anymore. You do, and it will be pretty much the same amount. One good piece of news is that for those people that are employed, your employer will do all of this for you. They will keep this money back along with your income tax and national insurance. They will make sure those payments are made, and you will just be given the balance as your net salary. If you're self-employed, though, you do have to ensure that you keep as much money back as you need to meet your student loan repayment. Just to put an idea, again, if we use £45,000 as the mean amount of debt that people get in, if interest rates stay roughly where they are, then you will need to be earning more than £60,000 a year before you pay off any principal. Until that point, you are just solely repaying interest. So we started this conversation by talking about student loans. And it sort of got me thinking a bit, are we really looking at a loan? Because any normal loan, the repayment goes up in value with the amount of money that you owe. Also, any normal loan, new lenders will take your previous debt into account. Your student debt doesn't work like that because new lenders aren't allowed to look at the balance on your student loan account when making a decision whether to lend you more money or not. Whilst it has an interest rate attached to it, which a normal loan does as well, that's about as far as it goes. So I would actually argue that the whole name student loan's actually wrong. What you're really getting into is a student tax, a 9% tax on earnings above £25,000. And if we think about it as a tax, mentally it's going to be loads easier to actually cope with than worrying about this ever accruing interest on this pile of debt that we've got. We don't need to worry about it because nobody else is going to be that concerned. New employers are not going to be concerned. New lenders are not going to be concerned. The only people that will really know about your student debt will be you and the student loan company. So I would really encourage you to think about it as a tax. And when you're talking to your folks as well, I would strongly urge you to explain why it's more like a tax than a loan. So overall, it's a chunk of debt. I guess the question on everyone's mind at the moment is it worth it? Well, that really depends on you. But the University of Kent have done a little bit of research on this, and their research has showed that anybody who gets the right degree should earn around £1 million more than somebody without that degree. But of course, the caveat there is, what's the right degree? If we'd have had this conversation back in, 1970, only 8% of your year group would have been going to university. That means that employers were impressed by any degree. By the noughties, 28% of your year group were going to university, which meant that employers had a lot more choice, loads more graduates to choose from. That means that thirds no longer really got people in the best position to earn the big money. But by the time you guys go off to uni, there'll be more than 65% of you going off to university. So employers have got even more choice. Thirds now are not really looked at particularly admiringly by employers. They don't really give you a particularly good background to come from when it comes to those better paid jobs. 2-2s really are only getting you now into the top 50% of job picks. So if you're going to be investing £45,000 of your own money, which is going to be going up at a rate of about £3,000 a year, my advice would be come away with a first or a 2-1. Of course, your degree is not the only thing that employers look at and not the only thing that will earn you money. But it is a really good start to walk away with that first or a 2-1 to back up your investment that you made in yourself. So will it ever end? Well, yes, of course it will. When you've paid it all back, that's principal plus interest. Or here's the other way it doesn't act quite like a loan. Because 40 years from the April after you graduate, any money that you still owe will be wiped off. So at the age for most of you of 61, you'll have debt in the form of mortgage perhaps. You'll have credit card debt, personal loans, car loans, all those sorts of things. But you will no longer have any student debt because that will be wiped clean. So are there any ways that you can actually keep your costs down if you're going to go down this route of university? Well, of course, taking a part-time job will improve your finances, but there's lots of people looking around for an ever-decreasing amount of jobs. So I would strongly urge, if you are looking to work when you go, make sure that you get to where you're going to be studying very early. Don't leave it until a couple of weeks before your course starts. And try and get one of those jobs that is going to pay you pretty well, but is also going to be relatively interesting to do. I can't emphasize enough the importance of you understanding how to budget. And I'll say again, please ensure that you run our budgeting session or go through our budgeting session to understand how to put one of those together if you don't already budget yourself. Use student discounts. You will be eligible for something called a totem card, which will cost you about 15 quid and give you loads and loads of different discounts. Use also your student rail card. That will cost you 30 quid, but gives you a third off of every rail journey for a whole year. There's a student coach card as well for I think 20 quid or 25 quid, which also gives you a third off of all coach journeys in the UK as well. So make sure you use those discounts everywhere. Think about your needs and goals when deciding where to go to uni. Don't be one of these people that decides where you're going to go and then thinks, oh, goodness me, I didn't realise it was going to cost that much. Do your homework before you actually make your decision. Work on your budget first and then decide whereabouts you can afford to go. And if you have any problems once you get to uni, anything to do with finance, please get in touch with your university finance department as a first stop. Talk to your family and folks. And also, of course, if you need to, do give us a ring and we will help out where we can. I hope you found that all useful. If you've got any more questions, please go on to a different section of the website where you will find our email address and drop us a line and we'll be only too happy to help. Good luck with your next choice.